Good evening and welcome to the Friends of the Concord Free Public Library presentation of the Ruth Ratner Miller Award for Excellence in American History. I'm Ann Urza-Leggett. I serve on the Friends of the Library Board, and the Friends have been presenting this award for many years. It was established in 1998 by the Miller children in honor of to honor the life and civic leadership of their mother, Ruth Ratner Miller. She believed passionately that understanding history was not merely desirable, but a civic and religious duty, and demonstrated this as an original member of the Holocaust Commission and a founding trustee of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., among other many great accomplishments. Our awardee tonight is a very fitting speaker, able to honor Ruth Ratner Miller's life and work, since she too has helped Americans understand current events in the context of our history. And I would like to note that her academic advisor, David Herbert Donald, was a former recipient of the Miller Award. So here's a quick overview of our evening. Matt Boger, Vice President of the Friends, will introduce our award winner, Professor Heather Cox Richardson. She will then speak and then answer questions which you can enter into the Q&A below, and I'll present them as time allows. Finally, I'll present the award, and then we'll be finished and we will not need to drive home. So may I now present Matt Boger.
It is the great honor of the Friends of the Concord Public Free Library to introduce our award winner, Professor Heather Cox Richardson. Professor Richardson is an American historian and a professor of history at Boston College, where she teaches courses in American Civil War, the Reconstruction era, and the American West, just to name a few classes. She previously taught history at MIT and the University of Massachusetts Amherst, all three fantastic Massachusetts schools of higher education, in part because of the great teachers such as Professor Richardson. She has authored many books in history and politics and is a founder and editor at weirhistory.org, a web magazine of popular history. She is also a co-host of the NPR podcast Freak Out and Carry On. To continue with her impressive resume, she is also a leading Twitter historian, explaining the historical background of modern political issues through Twitter threads. Her early work focused on the transformation of political ideology from the Civil War to the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt through the lens of race, economics, Western expansion, and the construction of the concept of American middle class. Her latest book, How the South Was Won, was named one of Washington Post's 50 most notable works of nonfiction in 2020. More recently, Professor Richardson started publishing Letters from an American, a nightly newsletter that chronicles the current events with the larger context of American history. The newsletter accrued tens of thousands of subscribers, making her one of the most, if not the most, successful individual authors of paid publication on Substack. We are truly honored and thrilled to both congratulate and welcome Professor Heather Cox Richardson.
It is an honor to be here and a real honor to win this award. And I want to thank, first of all, the Miller family, but I also want to call out the fact that their mother's ideas about the importance of history and civic engagement and why it matters are so in line with mine that I suspect that Ruth Ratner Miller and I would have had a lot to say to each other. And I will treasure the fact that I am carrying forward her legacy. I'm very, very pleased to be accepting this award. I would like to thank the Miller family then and for their honoring their mother, and also the Friends of the Concord Free Public Library, and also the Concord Festival of Authors who've made this possible. And most of all, I want to thank those of you who have given up your Friday night, or is it Saturday? I guess your Saturday night, to be here and listen to something that I might have to say. So I hope to keep you at least somewhat entertained for the next half hour or so, and then answer whatever questions you have. So when people ask me to talk about my last book, at this point it's been out for a while and I can certainly answer questions about it, but I thought it might be fun, instead of going over that book, to go ahead and talk more about some of the ideas behind it that might have some relevance for today. So one of the things that really jumps out at me when I talk nowadays about what's happening in the world is this really weird word we use a lot, and that's the word conservative. Because a lot of people are claiming that they are conservatives when they're acting in really quite radical ways. And that came to a fore recently, of course, with the fight over the raising of the debt ceiling, and the fact that people who called themselves conservative, who are now leading the Republican Party, were in fact calling for something that was extraordinarily radical, which was putting the country into a position to default on its debt, which by any definition is radical, and yet they call themselves conservative. So I thought it might be fun today to take a look at the history of the word conservative in America and in American politics and see where it came from and what we're really dealing with when we deal with that word. So when people nowadays call themselves conservative, what they are doing is they are harking back really to 1937. And the story behind that is that in the 1920s, the Republican Party, when it controlled the American government in the 1920s, had a very clear vision of the way the world was supposed to work. And what they really wanted to do was they expected to turn over the American government to businessmen, essentially, because they believed that men who understood how to run business could essentially run the government as a business, and that would be the most efficient way to move society forward. That eventually what would happen is that wealth would concentrate among a small group of people who were the ones who really understood how society would work, and they would go ahead and they would construct the nation in such a way that it would mean a booming economy for everybody, and everybody would do better in that economy. And you know about this from the 1920s with things like, the idea that the roaring 20s were helping everybody, that it was a wonderful period in American history. We have all these new kinds of technologies. We have radios, and we have nylon stockings, and we have refrigerators, and we have popular cars, and we even have things like Chris Crafts, the beautiful wooden motorboats. And there is this sense that if you look at the popular magazines, that the economy is doing so incredibly well that we're never going to really need to have reform organizations any longer, because everybody's going to have plenty of money. And so you're not going to have to deal with poverty and the problems that go along with it. And you get things like the book about Jesus Christ as the leader of a business who took 12 obscure men and turned them into a juggernaut that took over the world. And there's a sense in the 1920s that really what the US government should do is it should stay out of the way of those businessmen who are going to go ahead and make America great, if you will. And of course, that all comes crashing down with the crash of October of 1929, when the stock market crashes and plunges the country and the world into a Great Depression that's going to last for a long time. And when that happens, of course, American voters turn to elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, in 1932. And when they do that, when he takes office in 1933, he changes that government. That government that the Republicans had very deliberately turned over to business. They'd slashed taxes. They had gotten rid of regulation. They had turned over the organizations that had been created during the Progressive era to go ahead and protect individual consumers, for example. They literally turned those over to businessmen because they said they were stifling business in the form that they were in when the Republicans took them over in the 1920s, and this had to be turned over. Well, in the 1930s, beginning in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his advisors, people like Francis Perkins, who becomes a Secretary of Labor, deliberately change the way that the federal government works. In a sense, they go ahead and they adopt a sort of urban kind of government and apply it to the national government with the idea that the government should respond to the needs of ordinary people. So we get really quite dramatically jobs programs, we get the construction of a basic social safety net, and we get the government investing in infrastructure in places like the Tennessee Valley. So we get the Tennessee Valley Authority. And most dramatically, we get the Social Security Act. And the Social Security Act, while we tend to look at it now as as a provision for older people, and that's certainly in it. It was also an unemployment insurance. It was extraordinary help for women and dependent children. So there's this dramatic change in the way that the government works. And coming out of the 1920s, there are a number of Republicans who look at this and they see it as anathema. They're horrified by this change in the federal government. And there's not a lot they can do about it early on. They complain a great deal in FDR's first term, but in FDR's second term, they begin to discover that they've got allies in the Democratic Party. And those allies in the Democratic Party are Southern Democrats who don't like the fact that FDR's New Deal is beginning in a very rudimentary way, and it really doesn't go all that terribly far. But all those caveats aside, it is beginning to level the racial playing field in America, and they don't like that at all. So in 1937, some Southern Democrats and Republicans who hate the direction of the new federal government, especially its protection for labor and its business regulation, get together and they begin to talk about pushing back against the second term, FDR in his second term. He's reelected in 1936, and so they're going to push back in 1937. And when they do that, they get together in December of 1937 and they write a formal declaration of principles. And this formal declaration of principles on which the people who are opposed to the New Deal can coalesce and perhaps push back against FDR and the New Deal, they circulate quietly amongst themselves as something called the Conservative Manifesto. And what they mean by that when they talk about the Conservative Manifesto is they want to go back to the 1920s. They want to get rid of a government, and I'm going to explain to you what they say in just a minute, but they want to get rid of a government that they consider to be a radical change. So they want to go back to the old government of the 1920s. That's all they're talking about. When they call themselves conservative, they are talking about going back to that particular government. Listen to what they want. They address in their Conservative Manifesto, as it's known, it is called an address to the people of the United States. And in that address, there are 10 points. And that address rejects the idea of public spending. Again, this is during the New Deal. Calls private investment the bedrock of the economic health of the nation. So get rid of all that social spending. We have to turn back to private spending. It calls for tax cuts and cuts to social welfare spending because they say that they have to free up capital in order to increase private investment in the country. It calls for states' rights, home rule, and local self-government, which are all code words, of course, for get your hands off our racial structures in the US South. It calls for an end to public support for anybody who is able-bodied, and it calls for kinship and benevolence to provide the social safety net that people so desperately need. So they say at the end, we propose to preserve and rely upon the American system of private enterprise and initiative. If you listen to what I just described there, it is in fact a modern day conservative manifesto, a move to go back to the 1920s. And what happens is the New York Times gets a hold of this manifesto and it prints it on the front page on December 15th, 1937. And when that happens, the Republicans who have quietly signed on to it run in one direction because they want to join with the other Republicans to fight against FDR independently of the Democrats. And the Southern Democrats who signed on run away from it because they're Democrats and they don't want to be seen pushing back against their own presidents. So it falls apart at the lawmaking level, but the Declaration catches the attention of people across the nation who oppose the New Deal and the ideas in the New Deal. So chambers of commerce endorse it, citizens organizations endorse it, business organizations endorse it, manufacturing organizations reprint and they circulate 2 million copies of it. Anti-New Deal newspapers copy it and reprint it, and they give a blueprint for people who are opposed to FDR's New Deal. So that manifesto, that conservative manifesto, goes on from there to live in American politics pretty quickly. And even though that original manifesto is really lost to the tides of time, if you will, people like William F. Buckley Jr. pick it up when he's talking, first of all, in his 1951 book, God and Man at Yale. He references the idea of radicalism and conservatism, but he really begins to talk about it in 1954 when he writes McCarthy and His Enemies with his brother-in-law, L. Brent Bazell. And in that, they very deliberately divide the country between capital L liberals to suggest that they are an organized party. And by that, they mean everybody who agrees to the idea that the New Deal principles of government, the idea that the government has a role to play in providing a basic social safety net, regulating business, and promoting infrastructure. So it's not just Democrats they're talking about. They're talking about Democrats and Republicans who have signed on to the New Deal. So that's also going to be by 1954, that's also going to be Eisenhower Republicans. So on the one hand, they have the liberals, and then they pick up themselves, those people who adhere to the principles that are articulated in that conservative manifesto, as capital C conservatives. And that's where we get the idea that a conservative nowadays embraces those principles, which on their face are actually not at all conservative principles. That's not actually conservatism. So let me jump back and talk about when conservatism in America actually meant, because the contrast is really interesting. The idea of a conservative stance in politics, of course, comes out of the French Revolution. It's obviously not American at all. It comes out of the French Revolution when Edmund Burke, who's an Irish statesman, recoils from what was happening in France as the revolutionaries began to abolish the traditional hierarchies of government, start to get rid of the hierarchies in the church. And by 1790, Burke is so concerned about what he considers the excesses of the French Revolution, he writes a book that has a really interesting approach to government. He says, listen, what's going wrong on the other side of the channel is that the revolutionaries are trying to make the world adhere to a specific kind of ideology. And the problem with trying to govern according to an ideology is it doesn't reflect reality. And because it doesn't reflect reality, pretty soon revolutionaries are going to try and trim society to their ideology rather than the other way around. So at heart, Burke's argument is a criticism of people trying to legislate by ideology, not an embrace of it. What he says instead is that government should not be driven by ideology so much as being driven by trying to promote stability. And in order to promote stability, you need to do a number of things. You need to protect traditions, you need to protect hierarchies, you need to protect the church, you need to protect the family, you need to protect property, you need to protect all those things that promote stability, because your goal is to prevent upheavals and to make people's lives as stable as you possibly can. It's a very different kind of thing than this later group I'm talking about. But Burke goes ahead and he makes this argument in the 1790s. Never really takes on in America, and you can see why it doesn't take on in America, because America's a brand new country. It doesn't really have a lot of traditions to go ahead and uproot and to worry about. So as Americans are creating their own government, they're really not looking for anything long-standing to conserve yet. So that concept, that Burkean concept, doesn't come up. And the idea of conservatism in America isn't a term that's used a lot, really, until about the 1840s. And in the 1840s, Americans begin to use the term conservatism. And they used it, when they used it, as I say, rarely, they used it to identify somebody who opposed the radical reforms of the 1840s for things like people who wanted to end slavery, or people who wanted women to have rights. Those were considered radical ideas, and if you held yourself against those, sometimes you were called a conservative. But the word conservative begins to take on really important political meaning after the Compromise of 1850. And the reason that this becomes a big deal in 1850 is the compromise of that year requires federal officials, including federal officials in free states, slaves that don't practice human enslavement, to take back or to send back to the South anyone that a white man claims is his property. And so the Compromise of 1850 forces federal officials in the free states to return people that are called runaway slaves. But Black Americans could not testify in their own defense. Anyone who helped a so-called runaway could be imprisoned for 6 months and fined $1,000, which is about 3 years' income. And the only way that the only accusation that had to be there for somebody to say that a Black person was enslaved and had escaped is for a white person to say so. So it's a setup really here, and for Black Americans in the North and for the white Americans in the North who are now charged with returning them on somebody else's say so. And so quickly, Northerners, especially people who belonged to the Free Soil Party, which had organized to stop the spread of human enslavement into the lands that the U.S. had acquired from Mexico in 1848, they said no. They said, we refuse to accept the Fugitive Slave Act. We won't do that. And because they said they would not accept a law, because they rejected a law or the idea of the law, their opponents began to call them radicals. So that now you're starting to see this idea that people who oppose the Fugitive Slave Act and the enslavement that comes from that being called radicals. And then in 1854, when Northerners of all parties join against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is the one that overturns the Missouri Compromise and permits the spread of human enslavement into Western lands, where it had been abolished under the Missouri Compromise of 1820, a lot of Americans in the North start to say, no, we don't like this Kansas-Nebraska Act, and we're really concerned about the Fugitive Slave Act. We're really concerned about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And when that happened, again, enslavers and people who supported the idea of the spread of human enslavement began to call those people who were talking against those laws radicals. All right, we're not up to the word conservative yet, but it's coming in just a minute in a really interesting way. So in December of 1855, the president at the time, a Democrat, a man named Franklin Pierce, used his annual message to go ahead and to accuse those people who were opposing the spread of human enslavement as being people who were trying to overturn American traditions. And he gives this very long speech. Pierce was not known for being concise, in which he walks through American history and he portrays a portrait of American history in which And he says this quite explicitly. America has always been, the United States has always been a white man's republic, and that the founders had very deliberately established a hierarchy of races from the Declaration of Independence forward, and that was what it meant to be an American, and that the people who were trying to stop the spread of human enslavement were therefore radicals. Well, what happens then is that people who do oppose the spread of human enslavement are outraged. And at the Chicago Tribune, Joseph Medill, who was a lawyer and a staunch abolitionist and a leader of the Free Soil Party at the time, he's going to become a Republican later, he accuses Pierce and the people who support Pierce of being the ones who are attacking American laws. He says, the people who don't want slavery to spread are not the radicals. You're the radicals. He says there are perversions of historical facts and false statement in General Pierce's message, which cannot fail to arrest the attention and shock the feelings of the most conservative among us. So Medill begins to use the word conservative as a way to attack the enslavers rather than the other way around. It's a really important moment because he goes on and he calls out as false all through, he says, Pierce's declaration that the founders had created a federal republic of the free white men of the colonies, which is what Pierce had said. In fact, according to Medill, the founders had enshrined the nation's principles in the Declaration of Independence. Where in that document, Medill said, was the discussion of free white men? He went on to quote Pierce's message and he said, I don't see anything in here about subject races. He says, is there an intimation about the subject races, whether Indian or African? Their one guiding thought, the founders, that is, as they themselves proclaimed it, was the inalienable right of all men to freedom as a principle. So for the next few years, people who were moving into the new Republican Party that's going to form after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and really take off in 1856 continued to call anti-slavery thought conservative. We're the people who are trying to get back to the Declaration of Independence. We're the conservatives. We're not the radicals. At the same time that those who are accusing the Republic, at the same time that the Democrats and those who are accusing those who are opposing slavery of being wide-eyed radicals. So people like Stephen Douglas in the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 repeatedly tries to portray Lincoln as a radical, as a Black Republican. They use the N-word a lot. People who worship Black Americans. They're constantly trying to portray them as radical. And again, people like Joseph Medill and by 1858, Lincoln try to hammer home the idea that it's Douglas and the Democrats, not the Republicans, who are radicals. And Lincoln goes ahead in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and he claims to be fighting against slavery on, as he says, original principles, fighting in the Jeffersonian, Washingtonian, and Madisonian fashion. Now, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln does not use the word conservative, but really dramatically on February 22nd, 1860, he does so in New York City's Cooper Union, in the Cooper Union Address. In that Cooper Union Address, he claims the mantle of conservatism for the Republicans. And he actually echoes Franklin Pierce's 1855 message. And when he goes ahead, Lincoln goes ahead and retells the history of America. But in his history, the history was one in which the founders opposed human enslavement and the Republican Party was on their side. And really famously in the Cooper Union Address, he says, "You say you are conservative, eminently conservative, while we are revolutionary, destructive, or something of the sort." He's talking to Democrats here. What is conservatism? Is it not adherence to the old and tried against the new and untried? Echo of Burke, by the way, whom Lincoln, to my knowledge, never mentioned. He does actually talk about an Edmund Burke, but he's a doorman at the White House, as I recall. To go on, we stick to contend for the identical old policy on the point in controversy which was adopted by our fathers who framed the government under which we live, while you, with one accord, spit upon that old policy and insist upon substituting something new. Not one of all your various plans can show a precedent or an advocate in the century within which our government originated. Lincoln then, by 1860, has very deliberately linked the idea of conservatism not to the idea of the spread of enslavement, but rather to the Declaration of Independence, which is a dramatic difference between what Douglas was trying to do by calling them radicals, but also a dramatic difference from the modern day use of the term. So voters go ahead and they elect Lincoln president. And in so doing, they go ahead and they center the Declaration of Independence as the heart of American conservatism. That's the old way of doing things, the old idea that people are created equal, that is embedded in the Declaration of Independence, not the idea of the hierarchy of races and the hierarchy of peoples that the Southerners are arguing for at that point. In that process, for Lincoln, of considering the Declaration of Independence the center of American conservatism, he's going ahead and he's arguing that the federal government should indeed respond to ordinary Americans. And during the course of the Civil War, of course, not only does he put the Declaration of Independence at the heart of Americanism in the Gettysburg Address, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, which harks back to the Declaration of Independence and not to the Constitution. Not only does he do that, he and his Republicans very deliberately use the federal government to go ahead and serve the interests of ordinary Americans. They go ahead and they reinvent the American government, using it to put poor men onto homesteads, to create public universities, to create a transcontinental railroad. They invent national taxation, including the income tax, and establish the Internal Revenue Service. It's not called that at the time. That's why I hesitated. And of course, they go ahead and they agree that Black enslavement in America must end, except as punishment for a crime for which somebody is duly committed. As Lincoln wrote, the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do it all, or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. So by 1865, the party of Lincoln had put in practice their conservative position that the nation must embrace the principles that were embodied in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, they must have equal access to resources in order to enable them to work hard and to rise. And that, I would argue, is actually the traditional American definition of conservatism, rather than the one born in 1937 as a pushback against the very sort of government that Abraham Lincoln had originally constructed during the 1860s. The history of conservatism. And now, if you would like, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi. Great. Heather, thank you so much. That was fabulous. And I feel like there are a lot of oh my gosh, where to begin? So I will ask the first question, which was from Stefan Bader. And he asked, the discussion of the Fugitive Slave Act over a century ago sounds awfully close to Texas SB 8 regarding abortions today. Would you say that is so?
Stefan, I would not say that I included that by accident. The links, the legal argument behind them is very different, because After World War II, of course, we have a very different kind of jurisprudence in this country now, because when they had the Fugitive Slave Act, they didn't yet have the 14th Amendment. Fugitive Slave Act is 1850, 14th Amendment is 1868. And after World War II, of course, we get Chief Justice Earl Warren and Chief Justice Warren Burger, both appointed by Republicans, by the way, reaching through the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clauses of the 14th Amendment to reach back to the original Bill of Rights and pull them forward and apply them to the states. And so since then, when people are upset about their civil rights, they can go ahead and they can sue the various members of a state government who are enacting that. And that's why SB 8 was written the way it is. There's no one to sue. I mean, as you know, when I've written about that, what I'm most concerned about is if you can get rid of the constitutional right, because abortion is a constitutional right. If you can get rid of that by essentially creating vigilantes, what can't you get rid of? They're doing something very different in the 1850s because they don't have the issue of the 14th Amendment yet. But absolutely, it is designed essentially to create vigilantes to go and take Black people and bring them back to the South. And there's a wonderful historian who argued, and it really didn't get as much press as it ought to have, that we talk a lot about the Underground Railroad that takes Black Americans out of the South and takes them north. But he argued, and I think persuasively, that more free Black Americans were sold into slavery than the other way around, because they were essentially kidnapped and very valuable in the 1850s.
Wow. All right. The second question comes from Tammy Rose, who says, "Thank you so much for this. Thank you for bringing in the details of the horrors of the Fugitive Slave Act, and happy Harper's Ferry Day to you. Do you have any quick comments about John Brown and Thoreau?"
I don't have them. Yes and no. I am sensitive to the fact I'm speaking in Concord. I am less a fan of any of Thoreau's essays about politics than I am of his essays about travel. He was a brilliant travel writer. The Maine Woods book is just terrific. But the issues around John Brown are extraordinarily complicated. John Brown is a hero now. Most historians think he was probably mentally ill. He had a history of paranoia. He was jailed a number of times for debt, for sort of, he was a man who found who he was and who he thought he should be with the issue of anti-slavery. And of course, that led him to commit murder in Osawatomie, Kansas before the raid. And the raid was incredibly ill planned out. All that being said, the way that the John Brown arrest and hanging transpired was so deeply, deeply political that the issue of it took on something way bigger than it ought to have been. He was kind of out there, and he became this political martyr, or a martyr on one side and a villain on the other side, when he probably was simply mentally ill. So, I could walk you through one of the things I love about the hanging. The trial itself is really interesting because Henry A. Wise is the governor of Virginia, and he wants to be president. He foresees that the Democrats are going to go ahead and deadlock in 1860, and he feels like if he gets enough support, he's going to go ahead and be able to be the governor. So he's the one who says that Brown was going to kill everybody, and he sends pikes all over the state saying Brown was going to have your enslaved people rise up and kill you with these things. And of course, that's not the way it plays out. But Wise is a major deal in this. But as a result, he never lets anybody examine Brown for his mental health, or to actually have conversations with him about what was really going on. So even though we didn't have an insanity defense at that point, a lot could have come out that didn't. But what's interesting about that is then, of course, they execute Brown. And that's the part that really interests me. So listen to this. So Brown, when he's executed, is the first American executed for treason. He is executed for treason against the state of Virginia. We have never had there have been people who were accused of treason before that, but they all were either escaped or they were pardoned before anybody had to figure out what to do with them. So by executing them, what Virginia has done, and they're very articulate about this, is they have established that the punishment for treason is death. All right, fine, great. And they're pretty triumphant about this. Boy, you can't pull that crap on us. We're going to go ahead and hang you. Within a year, it's the Virginians who are committing treason. And this is one of the things that's going to make it very difficult for Lincoln to try. If Lincoln's always saying, I'm going to be nice to you. Don't worry, we're going to be okay. Part of that is because of the John Brown hanging, because they're very aware that they have set the precedent that treason should be punished by death. And then they go out and commit treason, and they're convinced that they are going to be hanged as well. So that's one of the aspects of the John Brown case that I think is interesting.
Right. My next question comes from Ruthie Bennett. And this is a big one. How do you find hope to continue believing in the American experiment?
Well, from things like this, from things from my neighbors, and from I just walked down the street, and you could hear laughter from all the houses. Americans are decent people. We really are. And I live in a number of worlds, so I know a lot of people in a lot of different worlds, and they're decent people. I firmly believe that we are in the crisis we're in now because politicians have deliberately divided us to gain power and to skew our laws in such a way that they benefit the very wealthy. And what I try and do is push back against that, so we remember we have commonalities that we all value. Is it a struggle to be hopeful? Yeah, but someone's got to do it.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, Rebecca Winborn asks, what is the role of populism in redefining what the conservatives and liberals have stood for?
So, Rebecca, that is a phenomenal question, and it's a hard one because we don't really have, to my mind, a good definition of populism. There's a lot of books out there that are talking about popularism, and I'm like, that's so cheating. Because what is a populist? Because sometimes we talk about populism as being a positive thing, as we do in the 1890s. Sometimes we talk about it being a negative thing. Sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. I would argue, I think if I had to, that populism rises, and this is a little bit bizarre, but populism rises, I think, because I've studied the old populists as well, at a moment when people recognize that they have been sold a bill of goods, if you will, and that their ideology does not meet their reality. And it sort of throws them in turmoil, like when the tide changes. And so we get a snapshot of both the old and the new. And that true populism is sometimes progressive and sometimes reactionary. It's both things together. And I would argue that the 2016 populism behind Donald Trump was that. People forget this, but Donald Trump was the most progressive Republican on that stage of 16 characters who were vying for the 2016 nomination. People forget that he never governed that way, but he called for fixing tax loopholes. He called for making healthcare more universal and freer. He called for the return of jobs. He called for a lot of progressive things that obviously he never intended to do. But for people who supported him, they thought he might be, believe it or not, I think, a Teddy Roosevelt. Or an FDR, somebody who had money, came from outside, and could just walk in and clean things up. But what we're seeing now is not, to my mind, actual populism. I think it looks much more to me like the kind of reactionary impulses that you got in the 1930s in France and Italy, for example, and the street violence that radicalizes people initially through violence and then teaches them politics. That's how we got the rise of Nazism in France and Italy. And even here in America, we forget that. There was a strong Nazi movement here in America because it didn't end up winning, but it certainly was here. And the person who theoretizes this, to my mind, most effectively, you may have read, and that's Eric Hoffer. Eric Hoffer was a longshoreman who wrote True Believers in 1951 when he was, everyone's like, why did Hitler come? Why did Mussolini come? And he says, who cares? Every generation has a Hitler and a Mussolini, and maybe many of them. The question is, why do people follow them? Because there are lots of people who would love to be dictators, and people, won't give them the time of day. Why do certain populations raise those people? And what Hoffer goes on to argue is that if you unsettle a population and give the rise of populism, for example, if you unsettle a population either through economic dislocation or cultural dislocation or religious dislocation, they become a very fruitful field for somebody who can promise to take them back to a world in which they enjoyed superiority, in which they were on top. And you can turn them against an enemy. It's not important who that enemy is. They just have to have somebody to hate. And increasingly, they have to abuse that enemy, because that psychologically binds them to the person who is urging them to that hatred. And you can take them quickly down a very dangerous rabbit hole. And that, I think, much more clearly defines where we are right now. These people are not populists. They are I don't want to say they're fascists, because I actually don't think we're in a fascist moment in America. I think we're in an authoritarian moment, but they are the supporters of a right-wing authoritarian government. And that's not populism.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to ask Elizabeth Comstock has a question, and it sort of falls into this. My family members who consider themselves staunchly conservative seem to use that term to mean conservative social values, evangelical Christianity, things like anti-abortion and racist policies. How do those views mesh with today's conservative politicians?
Well, I think they match up very closely with today's conservative politicians, because there's a link, very clearly and very powerfully after Ronald Reagan gets elected as somebody who embraces those conservative values. Remember, in this current moment, he says there's always that caveat at the beginning people forget. Government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. And he doesn't govern that way, but he talks like a movement conservative. These people who embrace the 1937 set of principles become known as movement conservatives because they are a political movement. They're not ideological conservatives, they're a political movement. And it's very clear, even when Reagan gets elected, that it's not at all clear that America wants that, because America actually likes a government that regulates business and provides a basic social safety net and promotes infrastructure. And so if you remember, I don't know how old you are, but if you remember, when Reagan was trying to get through his first initial tax cuts in 1981, they were going nowhere. Remember David Stockman, who was the Officer of Management and Budget? He wrote the budget, and then it turned out that it was supposed to, according to supply side economics, it was supposed to bring in all this money, and it turned out it was in fact going to drive the government deeply into the red. So he just reprogrammed all the computers, and people on Capitol Hill were like, "You can't do that, dude. That's not going to work." And that's when Hinckley shot
Ronald Reagan.
Yes, I'm thinking JR, and I'm thinking that can't be right. And the first thing that Reagan did, Reagan's popularity skyrocketed, if you remember. And the first address he gave after that was to Congress, televised, saying, "Pass my tax law." But it was very clear that it was not popular. And by the end of by like 85, or once they start pumping money into the economy, and that's what brings them over in 84. But by 85, when they want to put through the tax cut of 86, it's clear that they're not really convinced they're going to be able to go ahead and keep those tax cuts in place. They're not popular. And that's when they very aggressively turned to the evangelical Christians, because evangelical Christians until then had not been political, because they believed that God and mammon shouldn't mix, right? So they had not been heavy voters, and many of them had in fact supported Carter, who was himself, of course, a Christian, which is interesting because Reagan was not. So they very deliberately turned to court that, and from then they went on to go ahead and court that population really very deliberately. And I could tell you more about that. But to go back to the question about conservatism, the whole concept of being conservative and protecting things like the family is behind the fact that it's the Republican Party that starts to invest in Planned Parenthood, who wants to do things like permit there to be abortion. That's actually written by a Republican, that decision under a Republican Chief Justice, because they believe that a family should have control of things like reproduction. So that traditional conservatism, the ideological conservatism, the Lincoln conservatism, if you will, that was characterized the Republican Party during the Eisenhower years, is really very different than what it becomes under movement conservatism. And a great example of that, of course, is that it's one of the leaders in the early Planned Parenthood movement is the Bush's father, Prescott Bush.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So he's a big deal Republican out of Michigan. And he is himself a Christian and a Mormon, and I think he's a Mormon, but he's very religious himself. He ends up jumping out of the Republican parties. He had been a big supporter of Nelson Rockefeller, and when Nelson Rockefeller gets into trouble with a mistress, he won't support him for president, which is one of the things that throws it to Barry Goldwater in '64. So, but yeah, he's big behind Planned Parenthood because he says families should have, you need stable families who have control over their reproduction.
Interesting. All right, we're gonna need to wrap these up, and then there are several questions that sort of fall into the same, which is, I'm going to use Fred Van Dusen's, how serious is the current attack on our democracy and what should we be doing about it? Are there historical parallels to what's happening?
The attack on our democracy is the greatest attack America has ever been under, barring none. So if that didn't put the fear of God into your heart, it ought to have. People like me are beside ourselves. So what should you do? Fight for voting rights. Fight for voting rights. Fight for voting rights. Because what we are seeing right now does have a parallel. It's what happened in the American South after the Civil War, when through the kinds of disfranchisement methods we're seeing in the already 19 states, Republican-dominated states that have passed 33 laws so far to go ahead and take and restrict voting. Clearly, they're restricting Democratic voting, and to go ahead and, in many cases, take away from independent reporting officers how a state voted and turn that over to partisan boards. Had those measures been in place in 2020, Donald Trump would now be president, despite the fact he lost the popular vote by more than 7 million votes, and the Electoral College by 232 to 306. If they stay in place, we will have lost our democracy. And that's exactly what happened in the American South after about 1874, when they start to put in place a bunch of measures to make sure that African Americans and Republicans in the South couldn't vote. And I always like to say to people, remember, the South always held elections throughout that period. There were always elections. It was just predetermined that the Democrats were going to win. And that's exactly what we're looking at now. And the other piece to that, those who are like, well, I'm a Republican, I don't care. I'm a Trumper, I don't care. I say you care deeply, because once you get rid of a second party, that second party, you lose oversight. It means that there is no longer the rule of law, because, the sheriff's daughter gets off when she drives drunk and kills someone. But your daughter doesn't, because of who you know, because the law is about who you know and not any kind of fair legal system. And what that means, if you look at the American South in that period, is that nobody will invest in that region, because you have no protection for a business, because everything is about who knows whom. And so you have no baseline. I always like to point out that we get the Securities and Exchange on Wall Street, not because of populists or people in the street, but because other people who want to start businesses say, we can't start a business if we know that the stock market's rigged. We need to have a level playing field. And so I think that we're on the verge of turning this country into what the American South looked like from about 1874 to 1965. And I don't think Americans realize just how bad that's going to be. So are we in trouble? Yes. but there's a heck of a lot more of the people who want to preserve American democracy than who don't, and we simply have to make ourselves heard. You know, Monday that the right to vote, I'm sorry, the Freedom to Vote Act is coming up for cloture before the Senate, and it's going to be voted on Wednesday. And the real trick is whether or not Sinema and Kirsten Sinema of Arizona and Joe Manchin of West Virginia are going to permit a carve out of the filibuster to pass that bill. And I thought 3 weeks ago they were going to. I'm no longer convinced they're going to. So speak up, put pressure on Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, people who might make up the difference where Manchin and Sinema might not.
Might not. All right. Well, I don't know. That's good. That's a good call to arms, at least at the end. And I don't want. I'm sorry for those of you whose questions I didn't get to ask. These have been great questions, and I recommend you continue the conversation on Heather's website. But I also want to make sure that I have a chance to present you with the actual Ruth Ratner Miller Award. This is the award. It is a print of Sun Sparkles on Walden from Haywood's Peak. It's from the library's special collections of Herbert Wendell Gleason's photographic negatives of images of Concord. It was taken on October 21st, 1920, about 100 years ago, but I would say it looks like it could have been taken today. Although there probably would have been some long distance swimmers toting buoys had they taken it today. So on behalf of the Friends of the Concord Free Public Library, thank you for being here. And thank you and congratulations.
Thank you very much. As I say, I'm thrilled, and thank you to the Miller family. And let's hope that we carry forward her conviction that understanding history is not only desirable, as she said, but a civic duty, because we're all in this together.
Could not agree more. All right. Well, thank you so much. And for everyone, thank you for being here this evening. I'm glad we were all able to share the experience. If you'd like to buy any of Heather's books, they are on sale at the Concord Bookshop, Concord, and so as are many of the other books for the Concord Festival of Authors or other online sales. And I hope you'll go to the Concord Festival of Authors.org and enjoy other programs. And thank you, Heather, for this evening. It's just been wonderful. And thanks all of you for joining us, and have a great rest of your weekend. Good night.